Right, so I know I'm a little late to it, but there has been an update to formats and terminology surrounding Flesh and Blood, and I do want to start covering a lot more of the discussion side of Flesh and Blood. I do collect, if you don't know, I do collect, but I am very intrigued by the gameplay aspects. Essentially, it's really growing on me. I started just as a collector, but have been dabbling in play. I don't really have the capacity to go to LGS or anything like that. There's nothing in my area. I'd have to drive, hour plus just to play. So online resources have been great, but I do want to start diving into the discussion side of Flesh and Blood and start addressing some of the articles they release and some of the future prospects around Flesh and Blood, because there are some interesting thoughts I've had, especially pertaining to PvE, that I do want to go on maybe in a later video. Okay, so the commoner format has been updated. They are now allowing for rare, tokens, young, and equipment, I believe. Right? So your deck or your action cards still have to be common, but you are now able to use rare equipment. And this is a great thing. So it is sort of a disparity between equipment. Rare definitely doesn't see any real use. So pricing wise or collector wise is often grouped with common, especially cold foils. They don't see a huge necessity, unlike legendaries and majestics. So it is nice to see that rares are now being allowed in this commoner format. I still reckon don't bother with the cards. There is just this greater, sort of disparity between equipment and the rarities and what makes up, power levels within equipment compared to cards. Common is definitely still common, and rare feels rare in terms of usefulness when it comes to normal cards. But more importantly, there's 40 card plus 11 equipment and 1 young hero. So this totals up to 52 cards, right? So we're also being introduced to a few new terminology through the Tournament Rules and Policy update. So card pools. They've renamed decks, which is good. They're starting to branch out and, create an identity for themselves. And we also have inventory instead of sideboard. And inventory is definitely going to be important going forward, but we'll get to that in a second. So card pools. Right now, before this article, you had your deck, you had your sideboard, which was generally equipment you could transition to. I don't believe you could have a lot of cards to change up your deck structure. I might be wrong. Again, I haven't played competitively that much, but a 60-card deck makes up Classic Constructed, but you now have a 80-card pool. So this means that your extra deck, to use a common term, again, it's essentially equivalent to sideboard, right? Which is now inventory. So you have a 80-card side deck. You have a 20-card side deck and a 60-card main deck, or in this case, a card pool. And from that, you can reorganize your cards depending on your opponent, which is great. I like that it's no longer this weird number. So if you think about it in terms of equipment and hero, then 61 with your hero, and then roughly 66 to 67 with equipment, which is definitely odd, especially when, universally deck boxes come in generic sizes of 40, 60, 80, 100. So having these odd numbers is a bit weird. It's nice to have a round number that you can sort of use in terms of merchandising. So what does this mean? Well, we have a card limit increase, from my understanding, for Classic Constructed, but I haven't read anything about Blitz, and that's what Commoner is essentially is. There's also Blitz, the Blitz style decks of 40 cards. So right now, this is, again, 52. So I think this should be increased to 60. So you have a 60-card deck or card pool for Blitz formats, the quicker format. Then you have an 80-card card pool for Classic Constructed. And I think that would be perfect, because then we get into inventory. And inventory, like I said, is going to be super important. So inventory refers to all cards from your card pool that would be legal to play in your game but have not been selected at the start of game procedure. So they're the cards you can transition to, or, as we've seen now through Flick Knives and Concealed Blades, call upon with X action. So we're definitely going to see this branching development of ability to access your leftover cards in your inventory and use them to transition, which I think is great. I think the ability to utilize more equipment than your starting equipment is the next step that Flesh and Blood has to take in terms of competitive nature and ability to retool your deck X hero. So when you verse X person, is going to be a great thing. It's going to allow for more development and more competitive play and really, really figure out niches in the game. Because you can take a bad matchup and all of a sudden run X archetype that now allows you to counter them better. And a lot of the card sets, so to speak, in Flesh and Blood, so the amount of cards that synergize together is sort of minimalistic. You know, it's a good maybe 6 to 10 cards per theme or type of ability / action you're trying to run. So the ability to now swap these segments in and out of your deck is going to be great. You can turn what is your main theme of your deck and take out a few cards and make that the secondary nature of your deck and put in enough cards to now create a new main element that you're essentially trying to do. To put it in simpler terms, we'll take Ranger. So Riptide, for instance, you can either keep it as sort of tempo through normal arrow mechanics, or you could run traps. And then to tie in with traps or tempo in the in-between, you have all the immobilization arrows. So, for instance, those 3 types you could essentially switch around. If you're versing someone like Oldham, which, you know, is a stall slow deck, you could then run your traps and, you know, play stall. Or if you're versing someone quicker, you could take out the traps and keep the mobilizing arrows, but run more of the high tempo arrow cards, which is just a great feeling. And then the same can be done with equipment. But where does this really lead us? PvE. That's sort of the big thing that I want to talk about, because I do have a decent idea of what at least I would like to see in terms of PvE. But given everything we know, what's going to happen? Well, very simple. It will be almost a dungeon crawler-esque style of play. We now have an inventory, meaning that the ability to, say, get loot or restock your inventory, depending on the events that have unfolded in the PvE scenario, will now have a direct correlation, which is great, because I think what Flesh and Blood could really do, in fact, if I was them, I would probably try to get this out as quick as possible, especially given the current turmoil, is try to enter the D&D sort of area. So being able to create campaigns or scenarios, longer sequences where you team up with a group, you start with your classic decks, you maybe contribute to, say, a treasure pool or card pool, where you throw in cards you would like to add to your deck, but you can't at the moment, and as you conquer different PvE scenarios, call it bosses, call it enemies, call it maybe dungeons, who knows, you are rewarded with these extra cards you can then slot in and slot out. And I think that would be the dynamic thing. And I think the main idea that I have, just to give a little sneak peek, is something needs to be done with Shapeshifter. The simplest way to make PvE content sort of sustainable within the normal product is to have a Shapeshifter class that can utilize those PvE cards. What I mean by that is, in a normal set, you now have 3 or 4 heroes. You have one PvE scenario or boss or mob to fight, and they have their own set of cards, obviously, that go with them. But you have a hero designed specifically to utilize those PvE cards in a competitive setting, in a PvP setting. I think that would be a great way to make both things relevant within each set, because if you want to play as a boss, you can now play as a boss, so all cards are still relevant when it comes to PvP play, but then you're also able to pull said cards for PvE play. Right, anything else that I want to sort of go over? So it is 90 cards with boosters now, so 6 boosters. I thought it was 4. Right, because you only need 60 cards, but I guess it's easier to have the excess cards. But yeah, all in all, what we're seeing is a few things. We're seeing a transition to terminology set for Flesh and Blood, so everything is really being finalized and pushed and essentially developing in its own direction away from everyone else, which is great. You know, the majority of games generally use a similar format, same thing, as the stock standard current. You know, it's very simple. Take Pokemon. Pokemon is very similar to Magic, just very much simplified. And there's lots of games that are very much similar to one another in terms of of ability to play and what you play and how you play. Flesh and Blood, as I like to call it, is almost sort of like Uno. Yeah, you're throwing out cards that go together seemingly, but at the same time are still a decent mix. So it's like competitive Uno. Okay? But now we're seeing this transition to their own elements, their own design, where it's really, really cemented that this is Flesh and Blood. This is something that only Flesh and Blood can and will do. And I definitely can't wait to see what they have in store for PvE. I will probably make another video discussing, or showing off at least, my concrete ideas for PvE, because I have thought about it for quite a while, ever since, we heard of it. It's the main draw that I want to see in Flesh and Blood. If campaigns become a thing, I'm all in. I will go to competitive events. I'll do what needs to be done to play PvE Flesh and Blood, because I like working as a team. In fact, most of my decks are sort of jokey. Like, I like merchant decks, playing cards that sort of help one another. Should be interesting.